I'd like to introduce the panel. I have TJ Costello here from Cisco, James Benson from GE, and also Vincent from Bayshore. And then also what I'm going to do is turn over to guest moderator Chris Davis. Chris was assisting me with some of these sessions. And I would like to address a couple of the issues of the cities. You've heard what some of the smart cities issues are and some of the subject matter that we had discussed. We did talk about cybersecurity as being an issue for cities. But I think what we like to do is address some of the challenges that the cities are facing. And you know, there's some good topics here that we had discussed in our little session and created a little controversy. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris and go from there. So Chris, please.
All right. Can I set this here? Okay?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay, welcome everybody. Even though we're small in number, we're really smart in intellect, right? So I'd like to have the other panelists who did not speak please introduce themselves. So starting with, how about you, TJ, on the
My name is TJ Costello. I am responsible for our smart cities practice in the Americas from Cisco. Nice to meet you.
Okay, Vincent?
I'm Vincent Jomel from Bayshore Networks. I'm director for field services, meaning pre-sales and post-sales. And we're doing network-based cyber protection for industrial networks, which means we can also block, not just alerts when something happens.
And Jim?
I'm Jim Benson. I lead strategic alliances and marketing for GE's Smart Cities business.
Okay, what I'd like to do is to make this open, and so if we're talking about a topic and you have a question, just raise your hand, and Angela in the back will come by with a microphone. I'd like to also pick up and maybe explore in more depth some of the points that were made by the presenters. I think it's a good stepping off point for further discussion. And I'd like to start with, you talked, both Orlando and Atlanta talked about the initiatives you had underway and the progress, but what would your advice be to cities, both large and small, on how to get started?
So yes, great question. No city is going to be a complete smart city for the next 20 to 40 years. All right, so what we recommend to cities is to look at what your biggest challenges are and focus on those first. And that's why for us, we focus so much on public safety and tourism, right? And then we looked at opportunity as well. With so much sunlight here, we're looking at harnessing solar, offsetting our demands on the grid, and then working with some developers to maybe do some smart homes where we have solar powering the home, harnessing the solar for vehicles, and then using the vehicle as a backup generator if power goes down. So, short answer.
Yeah, just Christine, if you would maybe talk a little bit about sort of the planning, the organizational development, the politics, not in my backyard, and involving citizens, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, I would just emphasize the importance of taking a step back, and before you start talking to technology partners and before you start, plugging sensors in, to really think about what the challenges are, and as if for the utility partners, really being side by side with your cities in doing that. I think that role is important for our cities and leveraging that relationship that we have, because if you start plugging in technologies without really understanding that basis for your interests, I think you can set yourself up for failure. And as far as citizen engagement, I think something we are thinking about potentially, copying, frankly, is something that I know Jim worked on in San Diego. So maybe you want to talk about the street light.
Yeah, what we actually did there in San Diego is we had our intelligent node that's going to be all over San Diego, brought it out, and we had a block party where David Graham and the mayor brought out, told everyone what was going on. We actually used that as an ideation event. And so the citizens actually came and wrote down what they thought a smart city is and what they would like to see out of it, what their goals were. We took the time to explain to them exactly what the node data collection was going to be, how much of that was going to be shared on the open data portal, doesn't collect any personal identifiable information. So we really got the citizens comfortable with, hey, this thing isn't spying on me, it's actually going to help us be a better city and a better place to work, live, and play. And then one other thing that they did, because I think David Graham, who runs the city, their COO, he really does a great job. He realizes it's not just about engaging with the city, but it's engaging with the other city departments. And how can I use this to help break down the silos? So he had one day workout where each one of the departments came and talked about what they've done so far in the smart city space and what they're struggling with. And then he had us, a whole bunch of suppliers in the audience. We talked a little bit about the data we were going to be collecting, and then we just broke out into teams and talked about different ways that we could help them solve their problems. So it was both about trying to make sure that the data went horizontally across departments, and everybody was working to try and solve some of their toughest issues.
Good. TJ, any thoughts that you would have?
So I'd like to tell you there's one universal way to do a smart city. As a business leader, I sure would love that. What we find is the politics are different, the geography, the investment, the economy, everything is different. And so there's not a universal way to get in. I love, Charles, some of the things you said in terms of the advice you would give cities. But, Cary, North Carolina, 65,000 odd people, that city, small city, we're starting to see a range, before it was limited to large cities, et cetera. We're beginning to see just a plethora of small, medium, and large cities all move in a variety of ways. They had a lovely way of getting engaged where they had an economic development driver where they wanted to get greater awareness of who was coming into the downtown area, how many people, better asset utilization, better urban planning. So it started as simple as putting Wi-Fi in, taking the anonymized data off of the people that collected it. Then they added analytics into the traffic, into the public safety system, cameras, right? So it's there for public safety. They added analytics, so if your grandmother doesn't connect, right, they get to know that how many people there, correlate that information. Then they added visibility into their parking, and what they found is they had more visitors than they expected. They also found parking spots planning was poor, meaning they overinvested in handicap spots for some events and underinvested in handicap spots for others, so they had better urban planning data. They're using that real-time data also then to do better urban planning when they put up a new shopping mall or what have you. So getting started and having clear metrics of why you're doing it, who is the stakeholder that has it, why they have to do it, start small, scale later. Don't try to solve world peace out of the gate. It never works. And be very open and transparent and communicate with the citizens. And has been something, a pattern we've begun to see.
Great answer. Cities talk about, how do I fund, how do I pay for these new types of services that they need to offer? And I think we're really blessed that we have such a diverse group of people with deep experience in this space. So maybe starting with David and work our way this way. I realize you're pitch hitting for Heather, what would your advice be on what's sort of the best business model, and who are the players and who are the teams and who plays what role? If it's sort of ask that question of the whole group. What are some of the best practices you've seen?
Tough question. And I have to go back to ABB experience and from reading The Economist magazine all my life in the New York Times, right? And in ABB, we're such a large group. How do you break down the silos? So I joined Duke Energy, and I see silos inside of Duke. So if I go into a city, I can't imagine how the silos are built. So my only comment would be you'd have to put a team together and bring a forum. And I'm interested to hear if I don't know the org chart of a city. If we brought a city together, what would that team look like? But I can only say you can bring technology to the table, you can put your node up, and you can have hotspots everywhere, and you can have data flowing like crazy. And there's two things that I think we should do from a technology point of view. Treat the building as an object, put an abstraction layer on it, and manage it with an interface. I do the same thing with water. I would do it with all the pieces and manage it as an abstraction. And if you don't do that, it will be unmanageable. So these systems, and the other part, you better look at security. If there's not a security person on the team, it's going to be really lousy.
You told us this was going to be not a dark session. I don't know. Did you go dark?
I've been going to cyber conferences.
So at Cisco, we launched the City Infrastructure Finance Acceleration. It's $1 billion fund. Basically, what we looked at is any cities are very familiar with the concept of P3s, public-private partnerships. And they've done them for major infrastructure. So for example, toll roads and bridges and things like that. But when we looked at airports, were a good example. Anybody that, if you look back at the history of many of the US cities or global cities, those cities that leaned in before the technology of airplanes was obvious and the impact, and they put in airports, they did statistically better on economic output. We look at cities and smart cities and the digital layer that we can add onto the cities in much the same way. So this is one of the reasons traditional financing of technology is inefficient. We're seeing a blend of both lending, borrowing, equity investment, full venture investment, or in some cases a blend of all three or four segments. So that's why we put the fund together, and then it's scalable with our partners.
Yeah, if you look at the smart cities, it's not just all the city itself, the city government. You've got a good part which is, privately owned, privately organized. You've got the smart grid is mostly utilities investing, really. If you look at mobility, it's a lot of the manufacturers and the end users will pay for all the electronics in the cars and the connectivity. And if you look at building automation, which is also another big part of smart cities, most of it is owned by private entities, not city government. What makes the city smart is actually the connectivity of all these devices together. The connectivity is very important, and you need to keep the trust of all the stakeholders, as was mentioned earlier. Security and connectivity are going together. So this is where you need an entity to actually put all that together, make sure it's all done in one connected way, secure way. Otherwise, you're going to lose trust from a lot of people.
Yeah. So Christine, what about, let's say new collaborative business models and financing? What's your experience been in Atlanta, working with the City of Atlanta, GE, AT&T, Georgia Power, and I'm sure many other partners in the ecosystem, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's all about defining the outcomes for each individual party. I think we all recognize to implement a smart city, there's a lot of partnerships required, and there's a lot of give and take. And cellular carriers have some skin in the game, and as an electric utility, we have infrastructure to offer up, and the city has multiple departments that potentially can benefit from this, that have their own budgets. And so making sure that you tap into every party that has something to stand to win, I think is important in having transparent conversations. And so it's something we think about all the time. And the other thing I say, there's some third-party finance. I mean, you talked about the Cisco fund. There's some third-party financing models out there that are being actively piloted as well. So things to look at.
Jim?
Yeah, I kind of see over the projects we're working on, 4 different kind of means of cities financing those. And the first one is, the marriage of their local utility, like in Georgia Power's case, with the city, right? That a lot of times utilities are starting to feel their traditional business be a little bit compressed under pressure because of renewable energy, things coming off the grid, more energy savings. So they're looking for new ways to reach out and engage with the cities and their customers. And so what they tend to have a lot of is investment capital, so they can put in that infrastructure and then kind of use data as a service or intelligence as a service to really go back and create some tariffs and regulation on how they can go back and charge the city. So they can pay for it, nothing out of the city's pocket. The city pays as they use. So as they see that data value, they can then pay for it. So that's a great, one that we're working on, and I think it really helped us base scale. The second one is, as cities who haven't yet converted to LED, which, in the industry overall is less than 30%, if they go and take all of their street lighting, convert it to LED with controls, now all of a sudden they're going to get 60% energy savings. They could take that energy savings and help fund then the intelligent cities things that they want to do. And so that's really become, in San Diego's case, they were actually cash flow positive from year one. And so that's one way. There's also a lot of, grants out there. We're working in Canada right now, and their Canadian government just put out $200 million grant. Our U.S. Department of Transportation put out a $40 million grant that then was backed by additional public-private partnerships in the city, and so that's really driving in Columbus. So there's grants, there's the utility space that you can partner with, PPPs, and then driving the energy savings along with low municipal financing to really help the cities figure out how to fund these things.
Yeah. What opportunities are you as panelists seeing for revenue generation for these new smart city apps? I mean, lighting's obviously a good one, as we all know.
Advertising. The
Okay.
panel one that I've seen is.
Oh, so digital signage?
mechanism, yeah.
Christine, what?
Parking is another one. I mean, if you have more efficient it's a combination of both better, more efficient operations and perhaps enhanced revenue opportunity depending on your ability to deploy it. So, Charles, I know you're passionate about parking.
Yeah, all those are good, great things, and I'd add one more, which is just the use of the right-of-way. More and more folks enabling smart cities need to place their things in rights-of-way. And so that's a way for cities to earn money if your state legislature doesn't preempt that.
I think, there's a couple other, as you start getting into beacon technology, the city can, utilize that technology to do advertising to people that someone's close, have their notifications on. There's also some talk about, if the cameras were to detect a car accident. The city owns that data, so what can they do with that? Well, they could sell that to insurance companies so that insurance companies can avoid all the litigation costs and everything on the back end. So there's like a list of 20 other ones that kind of go into that space, but it's still new. We haven't figured out those models, so we're working with our customers, and a lot of other people in the space are trying to figure out those data monetization models. We know it's there. And then I think a bigger one that really drives the economic growth in the city is now you have this neural network that's providing data. And so tap into that. Have your entrepreneurs tap into that, have the local developers. And so we're developing Smart Cities Challenge where they take that data, build applications then that can not only be used in that city that's deploying, but also all the other cities. So now all of a sudden that little company that started up there has to hire people and you start creating jobs and economic growth. So that data, just like you think of our smartphones, when you first got that, there was a few apps on it. But who knew that that was going to be the huge market that it is today? And 1.9 million jobs just created from that. That same thing is going to happen in the smart city space. And so that's really monetization in a different route.
David raised his hand down there.
Yeah, in order to do that, though, you have to have a platform. What's that platform going to be for people to be able to develop applications against? Do you know?
Yeah, I think, the key thing for that is really being open. So it's getting the data to where it needs to be, to the developers, and, safe, secure, RESTful APIs that can be addressed. And then taking that data, and if they like IBM Bluemix, if they like Microsoft Azure, whatever it is that they want to develop that on, let it be open. I think that's another big thing that we need to do as we develop smart cities, is make sure it's open and interoperable so that the sensors can talk to one another and the data can be used by anyone who needs it.
We have a question from the audience?
Yes, a question here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm interested from the perspective of the panel, how you can implement this platform, example being streetlights, where you're going to control streetlights going on and off, dimming or multi-level street lighting through a control network. You may have advertising signs on there. You may have the cameras, which bring in a whole level of making sure that you're able to use it for police enforcement or criminal enforcement, which has a whole different band of requirements on it. How do you set that platform up and ensure that we don't have somebody walking around with a remote control device that starts dimming the lights, right? Or has the ability to hack into the cameras, or literally can start changing the advertising, which I've seen already on electronic screens. How do you share, or do you, the security of that platform so that when we need streetlights, they are on and not expose us to this broad risk that has liability associated with it?
Yeah, let's break your question up into two parts. I think the first is data and application management, and then the second is cybersecurity. So who'd like to tackle those?
Go ahead.
I mean, for us, we look at it as an architectural approach. You have to have the end game in mind when you're putting the architecture together, and we put a series of validated designs together that go through robust planning. We'll publish those as best practices, and we go through it at every layer of the stack, through the software stack all the way down. And with that plan in place, you you have generally the best chances to be successful.
Vincent, you want to take a stab at the
Just
cybersecurity?
one question. In this entire conference, I haven't seen a consolidated best practices plan come out on cybersecurity and networks and other things of that nature. And that's where I'm struggling is who develops that best practices that we can actually go out and implement across the campus?
That was in the doom and gloom session yesterday that David was in.
And the session that I just did a little while ago on the grid and cyber use cases had to do with our control system today. There is no security really in the edge devices. You might have some of the gateways, and it's kind of there's a lot of great requirements documents out there. I've read all of them. NIST 7628, I heard about a new one this week. IEC 62351, all the stuff that you need to apply. They all say go do security, do PKI, do all this great stuff, but there are really, in my view, there are no best practices. I did learn in the last session from a group, well, I got that, but also the identity protocol. It exists, was ratified in 2015. I didn't know this. I felt really sort of bad about that one. But anyway, HIP, yeah. So, but go back to the architecture question, for example. So I would love to work on this architecture because essentially I would try to have one network, but then you have to subnet it. If you go with a publish and subscribe kind of model, you'd have topics that are published that only some people can. I'd look at it as a big control system. And ultimately, you've got to have, today's best practice is certificates. And to be a member of a group, you have to be able to give your certificate so they have the public key so they can yak it up with you, right? So, I mean, certificates are about layers of control and who can talk to who. And this is a complex problem, and I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what best practice is, but I can tell you this session was named bottom up, right? And I would go, your recommendation, so somebody said start small, right? The idea would be bottom up, take one at a time, and secure it, because I don't know, I think it'd be really difficult to plan this whole thing top-down architecture.
Yeah. Question here? We'll get a mic to you. Hold on. Yeah, please. Yeah, state your name and organization if you choose to.
Tino Lanzer at mCloud. No one's talked about blockchain as far as securing the cyber communications. Any comments?
I don't know enough about it, so I'll just pass on that.
So I'd say what we saw as a pattern, it's an initiative, there's a lead initiative strategist within our Chief Strategies Trust Office. And it was a topic that probably didn't come up 2 years ago, but it is a topic that probably comes up 20% of the time now. So when you start to think about it, when you're deploying one sensor, 5 sensors, and you put in, at the end of the day, smart cities really are about automation. When you're gonna put in a lot of net new devices, we have prevailing forces, right? So you're not gonna add a comparable number of people to the number of devices. You have to have automation, and automation requires a higher degree of security. In addition, the cities are faced with a graying tsunami. So for example, in the city of Las Vegas, they're gonna lose 30 to 40% of their staff is gonna retire in the next 5 years. That is not an uncommon statistic. So you have competing forces. Automation has to play a larger role. So when you imagine a city where they deploy sensors and they place a policy in effect that says, if this, then this, right? Water in a storm drain, start the disaster replanning, et cetera. Blockchain potentially could be one of the technologies that plays a factor in that. It's still early. We do see it in more discrete deployments, contained situations. We haven't seen it deployed at scale yet. But certainly it's a technology I know we're paying deep attention to for the reasons that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of raised a really good point, and the cybersecurity question from the back, to me, looks like a subset or highly related to network selection. So if you look at, okay, smart city is automation, it's connection, it's data, it's instrumenting the physical world, whatever that is. So what are the networks to deploy and use for what applications, and then how do they integrate into an overall networking scheme? So anybody want to take a stab at that?
If you look at it, the network infrastructure is with a backbone. There'll always be a backbone connecting the different components. what's going to be on it and how it is on individual devices. If you look at a street light, you actually have many different activities and really different sensors connected there which have nothing to do with each other. If you're looking at the camera with a lightning control, they shouldn't be on the same network, really. They actually have different functions. So you need to actually segment this so that whoever has access to the camera doesn't have access to the lightning control while still keeping it all together. So you need this effective segmentation on the endpoint. The challenge is on the smart grid, on all the smart cities, you've got many endpoints. You don't have a perimeter to protect. The perimeter is everywhere. On the lampposts are actually pretty protected. People are going to climb up there, but you go to smart meters, they're easily accessible anywhere on the street, right? Anybody can just go plug in there. This is where the real challenge starts. You can protect a lamppost probably reasonably well for the physical aspect of plugging in. Yeah, bucket truck. Yeah, it's actually the threshold is a bit higher than going to residential area and just plug in outside, right? But we have to have a combinations of we need to have actually our grid resilient, our cyber security has to be resilient. These people are going to be connecting. We need to make sure that we can actually protect this and we can deal with this intrusion. There will be intrusion because it's so easy to just plug in.
Yeah, you know, one of the things we have is a team at GE that's all they do all day long is break into our systems. We find the holes and we patch them, right? So doing that along with making sure that you have complete end-to-end security from the very, the network connection, the different PoE and different ports that they can bring or attach into. At the edge, we have a large processor in the edge in the streetlights, and so making sure that that's secure, and we work with Intel on that, and then making sure as it goes up to the cloud, so the connectivity through AT&T and the SIM card, so really making sure that all the way from the beginning to the end, till it gets to, let's say, that the city's open data portal, that is very protected. So we do a bunch of different mechanisms to do that, and make you feel a little bit better. GE, we protect nuclear power plants. We do 50% of the world's energy production. There's real-time data monitoring on aircraft engines. And so taking all that data and that security that we've learned and bringing that into something as simple as a lamppost is really important to us. And so a lot of those key technologies like blockchain and figuring out how we're going to apply all that security is being driven down into IoT simple devices.
Question in the back. Please stand up and state your name and
certainly.
company.
My name is Steve Banker. I'm with ARC. I'm curious about autonomous vehicles and the kind of data that's going to be exchanged between smart cities and autonomous vehicles.
Charles, we had this conversation at lunch.
Yeah. I can also add on this if need be. Go ahead.
So it's going to be terabytes of data, all kinds of different data. Much like the streetlights will be data that different people need to access. Some people may need to access all of it. I heard my partner, Dean Bushy, down at Florida Polytech, down I-4, he is working on a SunTrax project and autonomous vehicles, building them every day. And he says the data that you'd have at a stadium right now, a full football stadium, might be 15 terabytes or so. Autonomous vehicles are going to have double or more of that requirement. So, what we're talking about at lunch today is that there are different levels of automation. All right, so, we have some level 3 autonomous vehicles now. We're going to eventually.
That means assisted.
Yes, we're eventually
not fully autonomous.
We're eventually going to go to level 5. The communications technology to facilitate that is changing. We're going to 5G across the country soon, and the National Science Foundation is expecting that what we will need to do is go to 6 and 7G and beyond. It's a tough topic that you raised, and because of that, we don't think we'll get to full automation for 20 to 30 years, especially changing out the vehicle fleet and having the roadside furniture to facilitate that. What the National Science Foundation is doing is trying to get teams to work on a project called PAWR, P-A-W-R, you can look that up. It's Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research, where we would look beyond 5G that's being deployed and look to 6 and 7G and beyond because of the amounts of data that need to be moved. the redundancy and reliability that are needed, and the resilience that's needed. So for example, what they're trying to envision is that if someone has a crash on the side of a roadway, the surgeon at the hospital can be directing with very low latency, very high speed, very high bandwidth, can be directing how that person is extricated from the vehicle, and all types of stuff can be done with that person in that vehicle before they get to the hospital. So when they get to the hospital, there's not that 30 to 45-minute wait. So it's a tough topic that you raised, and the National Science Foundation is trying to address it by facilitating the research, working with communications providers and others who are helping to fund the research. All the major ones, Verizon, AT&T now, are all in it together, trying to help fund this with the National Science Foundation, working with universities and communities to develop it in a laboratory fashion, and then at scale in mid-sized cities. Orlando was one in the last round. They have the second round of competition this spring. But it's to address exactly what you're talking about that has not been addressed sufficiently yet, but there's a vision to develop the technology to address it.
So I would just add, it's the fastest growing portion of my smart cities business. I believe what I'm proud to be part of. When I look at smart cities and, what is it, you get a variety of answers. So I look at transportation as something that can solve the urban divide, the digital divide. You're going to have to wire up cities in ways you've never even imagined, both to service that vehicle to infrastructure communication, as well as for the electrification that's going to take place. Lighting is good, but it's the most robust applications are there, and when you're lighting up a city, you're going to have to put infrastructure out. You're going to be able to, and I love something you mentioned earlier in the first part of your talk. The equality of it is when you break the digital divide and you bring people in that are more inclusive, you're more apt to grow your economy. You're also able to make cities a little safer because there's not as much restlessness. There's more economic opportunity, and all those things come together. And we're just at the tip of the spear. What we see is connected corridors, Ohio Turnpike, or at a state level, a variety. They're doing connected intersections now to be able to manage the asset more effectively, and then layer on how to carry, as an example. They started off with parting, liking, and crowd, and those types of things. And now they want to connect up their traffic lights so that when the crowd grows, they can hold the light or change the light. So you're starting to see the emergence of these patterns converging. And it's fun, and it's a great space to be in.
Just to add, one thing is a lot of people think fiber is going away. No, there's going to be a role for fiber going way into the future. So that's going to be the backbone, but the real thing is to facilitate these very broadband, very high speed, low latency wireless communications, and that's what the National Science Foundation is trying to address right now, because folks are just looking at making things that will require this foundation to be there so that they can operate.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so are there any more questions from the audience? Please state your name.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank the panel for all your input. My name is Kip Gearing. I'm with a company called Zage Security, and I have a general question, but I also want to address this gentleman's comment about blockchain. We provide a security platform for allowing trust to be established between users, devices, and applications, not only north-south like every IoT company out there, but also east-west. So edge computing, peer-to-peer computing, autonomous data-driven actions. So we have found some interesting use cases there where blockchain really is a perfect fit for allowing security and trust to be established at the edge. My main question is, throughout the conversation today, we've heard a lot about different deployments of technology that really enable smart cities to do great things, and many, many stakeholders. What's not clear to me is, as the accountability of cybersecurity and in case of an incident that occurs across all of these technology platforms that are being deployed, and ultimately who's accountable for protecting all of that infrastructure if it's deployed from a smart city perspective. So I was just interested in your thoughts and experience there, because I expect it's probably different and it depends. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question. Great question. Anybody want to take a swag
I think
at
he
that
answered
one?
his own question. Do we need, honestly, it's all dependent on the size of the city. In some cases, there are clear owners, a CISO. In other cases, there's a resiliency officer and an emerging chief data officer, like in San Diego, in this one of the cities Jim mentioned. There seems to be shared in others. There are no clear owners because they're under-resourced. So where we see customers struggling with retention. So perhaps they become good security experts and they get plucked away from the private sector. So that's one of the common issues. And so therefore, a lot of times what we see is not clear owners. Unless they're slightly larger than a mid-tier city, then they usually have a dedicated staff. That's been my experience.
All right, we've got about a couple minutes left, so in closing, I'd like to thank the panelists and you, the audience, for participating. And 30 seconds, as smart city practitioners, what advice would you give the audience if they're from a city, from a utility, from a technology provider? 30 seconds. Charles, you go first.
Okay, so the advice I would give is to have a proactive, continuing dialogue with your stakeholders. That's the most important thing for a smart city. Make sure that your stakeholders and you have a two-way dialogue going from the beginning and have it continuing.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll just follow on that. I think, us as a solution providers, if the city has done that work and we come in and they already know exactly what they're trying to achieve and they have the KPIs, we can better work together to really help drive that.
Yeah, maybe just saying it in a different way. It's about the technology, but it's not about the technology. It's about driving outcomes, and keeping that in mind for all the technology providers out there, I think is really important. We get approached, I'm sure lots of cities get approached by hundreds of technology vendors all the time trying to sell their widget, trying to sell their solution, and I think if they spent a little more time kind of trying to understand what we're trying to do and what the cities are trying to do, I think we could have a much better dialogue.
I would just say with connectivity brings responsibility, and you really have to be at the forefront of everything else which is happening after that,
It's easy. Get started and collaborate. I think every customer that gets started, they learn a lot about their organizations. Christine mentioned something earlier about the Atlanta example where they got groups together for the first time. What we've experienced is once they get started, once they learn how to collaborate, they're beginning to break down their political silos. That is often the real issue. It's not technology. The technology's there. It's the organizational structures and the habits. And so getting started often is probably the most exciting thing. Orlando seems like they're quite far down the path, but that would be my advice.
And David, wrap it up.
Yeah, okay, so I think leadership, for sure, you just mentioned this, and cross-organizational team members with someone from each discipline if you really want to be successful at this thing. And then the last would be figure out what projects you want to do, prioritize them, and figure out which ones have a return on investment, and try to chase it that way.
Yeah, right. Let's give the panel a round of applause. And